and welcome to the India Briefing. I'm Mukulika Banerjee in London, joined by my co-host Pragya Tiwari in New Delhi. India has just celebrated its 75th Republic Day. In 1950, India became a republic, a moment when it established itself not simply as a sovereign power independent of the British Empire and monarchy, but also defined itself as a democratic republic, which was to commit itself to creating not just a set of institutional democratic forms, but also to try and create a democratic society, which meant the Constitution of India guarantees all citizens justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, India, as we know, is an extremely complex and diverse country. It has over 800 languages, all the world's religions, huge diversity in food and culture and manners and customs. So, wanting to create a country constitution that would guarantee that all this diversity could coexist in a spirit of accommodation was an audacious ambition. So we thought this might be a good moment, Pragya and I thought, we would look at India's largest minority community to see how India is doing in its ambition to be this kind of republic.
India's Muslim population is nearly 200 million strong.
This makes the Muslim community in India the third largest Muslim community in any country anywhere in the world. And we thought to assess where we are in terms of these constitutional principles of justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity with respect to the Muslim population in India, we would speak to Professor Christophe Jaffrelot. Christophe has studied India since 1984. He has made many visits to India, speaks Hindi, has done detailed field work, collaborated with students, colleagues, journalists. Christophe's earlier publications, of which there are too many to count, but we will list them. Christophe has worked on the rise of the plebeians, the rise of the democratized OBC class that entered electoral politics. He's written about Ambedkar, he's written about political violence, and a number of different issues. He's professor at Sciences Po, Paris, and also visiting professor at King's College, London, and has just been elected president of the professional body of South Asianists in the UK, the British Association of South Asian Studies. Welcome to the podcast, Christophe.
Welcome, Christophe, and what a pleasure and privilege it is to be talking with you. We've both of us have followed and admired your work for so long. And the immediate context, of course, in which we are speaking with you is that you have just concluded a very multi-year, large-scale study of the Muslim population, Muslim society and politics in India. Now, like Mukulika mentioned, the third largest Muslim population anywhere in the world, it is a large minority. So it shouldn't beg asking why the population should be studied, why its circumstances, social and political and economic, should be studied. But also to bear in mind that since 2006, when we had the Sachar Committee report that looked into the socio-economic status of Muslims in India, we've not had a large-scale study since. So the reasons are obvious, but I'm curious about what your reasons were for taking up such a sort of mammoth study of the population. What were the kind of answers that you were in search of?
Well, my personal motivation, I would say, crystallized while I was doing research in Gujarat. After the 2002 pogrom, I visited Gujarat and Ahmedabad, especially every year, sometimes twice a year. Between 2001 and 2020, in fact, I visited not only Ahmedabad, but also Juapura, one of the largest Muslim ghettos in India. And therefore, it was very important for me to see whether the way Muslims were becoming second-class citizens in Gujarat was something that could also happen to them elsewhere. So that was the initial impulse. Now there was also in the meantime a very important book that I co-edited with Laurent Geyer, Muslims in Indian Cities. And this book that was made with something like a dozen of Indian and European and American colleagues helped us to also see what was going on in the Indian cities of India, not only Gujarat, far from that. In fact, in this book, I co-authored a chapter on Ahmedabad, but also a chapter on Bhopal, the place I visited first repeatedly in the 80s and 90s. And that was another very important motivation, to see whether what we saw in the cities was true elsewhere. And that's how we built a team. We built a team of a large number of people to do this research.
You said that you put a large number of people together to take the study forward. Could you tell us a little bit more about the partnerships that have come together to make this study happen, how long it's taken, and just how you structured it and how you went about it?
Yes, in fact, we built a consortium of universities. Sciences Po was taking the lead, but Princeton University colleagues and Columbia University colleagues were also in the driver's seats. Then we could make many people interested in this, but I'm not supposed to reveal all the names, as you may understand. For many of them based in India, this is not easy, but colleagues from the best institutions of India, all over India, joined, and something like at the end 60 people were part of this network. I want to insist on one very important point. Among the Indian contributors, there are not only Muslims, and we have many non-Muslim scholars, Indian scholars, who are part of this network. Some of them very young, some of them really, PhD students, others much more experienced, but for all kinds of places, because this is a pan-Indian study. And therefore, to see what it is to be a Muslim in Chennai today is as important as to see what it is to be a Muslim in Faizabad or in Muzaffarnagar. In fact, we have a documentary on Muzaffarnagar. Muzaffarnagar, 10 years later, is an interesting documentary that will be released very soon.
I'm glad you emphasized that point, Christophe, that not everybody researching and writing about Muslim communities in India has to be Muslim. A lot of people, I'm an anthropologist, you can study anywhere, but this is also a really important question to think about when thinking about India, because we rehearse this fact that India is a democracy, but of course a democracy is not majoritarianism. A democracy is judged by the health of the minority populations and how well we look after minority populations, which is why when there is such a large minority, it is so important to take stock of that while thinking about India's trajectory as a democracy.
So Mukulika, you put that really well, that at the end of the day, the health of a democracy is one of the ways to judge that health is to see how its minorities are doing. I wonder, Christophe, when you ask questions like how are the Muslims of Chennai doing or how the Muslims of Faizabad doing, what are the parameters that you're using to answer that question? What might be some of the themes along which the study was conducted?
Well, this is, of course, the core questions. What do you measure? What do you study to make sense of the condition of Muslims in India today. So initially we had 10 teams working on 10 themes, and I'm going to just list them for you to figure out what were the main axes. The first one was on the socio-economic and educational situation. How do Muslims do in socio-economic terms? And of course, in the schools, in the higher education system. The second team worked on institutional exclusion. Where do we find Muslims in the bureaucracy, in the judiciary, in the assemblies, in the army, in the police? Then you have a very important theme that is on violence and the changing form of communal violence. Now, there's been Hindu-Muslim riots in India for decades, if not centuries. Now we see different forms of violence, including lynchings. To understand how things have changed, we had a specific team that was completely dedicated to this important subject. Related to that, there is a question that the team explored on how does Muslims relate to the police and the judiciary, and vice versa. And that is something that we did ethnographically as well as statistically. Fifth, Muslim women. What about the situation of Muslim women in a context in an Indian government, or if you say regime, that says we are going to emancipate Muslim women, the triple talaq, so on. What has been the reality of this reform? Then a team worked on Jammu and Kashmir. And of course, we started before abolition of Article 370, when statehood was still there, and we saw the change. And till the last elections, because we met for the last time in December, only a couple of months ago. Then there is a very important subject that I have mentioned before, that is ghettoization. What does it mean not to be able to live in mixed neighborhoods? What is a ghetto? A ghetto is a place where you have the rich and the poor together for safety. And we see this problem of the absence of the vanishing of mixed neighborhoods because of what they call the fight against land jihad, because of so many laws also, at least at the local level, at least in a place like Gujarat. Hindu cannot sell its property to someone who is not from his community without the authorization of the district collector. That never comes when the man who wants to buy is a Muslim. Of course, in this context, we had to build a team on, okay, how do Muslims react to all that? What is the response in terms of potential radicalization, potential, if you want, also return to kinds of orthodoxy, quote unquote. And that was a very interesting team that did a lot of work on the Salafization of some Muslims, but also most of the time resignation to a new situation, and therefore obliteration of what makes you a Muslim, including the language. Not easy to say salam alaikum publicly in the metro these days in some places. And the last thing that we had, that we still have, we have had to add two more, but initially the last one was, where are the leaders? Who are the Muslim leaders? Political leaders, of course, of AC, but religious leaders, who are the religious leaders of the Muslims today? We don't have Imam Bukhari anymore. Of course not. We don't have Shahabuddin anymore. So who is there? And not only in the domain of politics, but also in the domain of educational institutions. Where are the Aligarh Muslim University leaders of yesterday and so many other places, plus NGOs, of course. We have had to add 2 teams in the course of our research that was more than 4 years long. One, first of all, because we wanted also to see how the rest of the world reacted to that. What did we say about that in the US, in the West at large, and in the Muslim world, in the Middle East, in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia? What kind of reaction could we identify? And in fact, very little. People react when the Prophet is insulted. Few people react when Muslims are persecuted. And the very last team that we have had to add had to do with social media, because it was everywhere. Social media played a role in each and every team. Just one example, we speak about lynchings. Lynchings is, of course, something that you will find on the social media. It's part of a propaganda machine. So we have a transversal kind of team that looks at what about social media in the whole story of these different themes.
Yeah, no, it's a grim picture, Christophe, but isn't there a large opinion that would push back against this portrayal that the project has found of Muslims? You talk about ghettoization, you talk about obliteration. I mean, these are pretty strong words. And I want to pick up on some of them. Isn't there, you may talk about ghettoization, but the contrary opinion would say that no, Muslims chose to live together. You talk about obliteration, but Muslims in India have always had their own institutions, they've had their own personal law. In fact, new laws have been brought in to protect the rights of Muslim women, which is something that in the global community is always welcomed, because the portrayal, the view that Muslims in India have actually been quite a pampered and looked after minority with a huge amount of autonomy and consideration in the polity, which is largely Hindu and other religions. After all, Muslims form, about 14-15% of the Indian population. So is there a balancing set of observations that one can make to what you've just given us?
Well, the first thing you can say, and this is really one of the findings I would like to highlight, is that in many ways, things were not so different 10, 15, 20 years ago. And if the Sacha Committee report was formed by Manmohan Singh 10 years before Narendra Modi took over power in India, it is a clear indication that the problem we are looking at today is not new. It's not new at all. But there are new developments still. The absence of Muslim leaders in the state apparatus at a certain level is completely new. The fact that there is not even one Muslim minister in today's government, this is completely unprecedented. The fact that you don't have even one Muslim member of parliament in the ranks of the ruling party for now almost 10 years, this is completely unprecedented. So you have new things that needs to be highlighted, and others which are certainly more of the same, which is a very important point to make. And the team, each team has looked at the situation before 2014 to see whether things could be compared. And in some places in some cases it could be compared, in some others it could not. Kashmir is a very new situation. Even ghettoization has taken new dimensions. But you asked the question also, Mukulika, of, well, do people think that Muslims deserve it? And do we have a public opinion that is now in this mindset? Well, we decided to have a survey because this is something we wanted to investigate. How deep is the prejudice? How deep is the anti-Muslim prejudice? And this survey that was made by the CSDS and Locknity was, of course, very interesting, especially because it showed that the idea that Muslims are pampered is really very, very widely spread. 47% of the interviewees indicate that Muslims are pampered, which is so counterintuitive when you look at their socio-economic condition and political condition. You have also the sentiment among many Hindus that Muslims are not as trustworthy as anyone else. 27% of Hindu interviewees don't consider them as trustworthy as anyone else, and the same percentage do not consider them as patriotic as anyone else. What this survey is also revealing is the North-South gap. This is so important to notice. The West and the North cultivate this prejudice when in the South you have a resilient form of secularism. So that was one of the findings among many others that we could highlight.
And one should add here that there are very significant Muslim populations even in the south, right? Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh. These are states with large Muslim populations alongside the sort of Lucknow and Agra and Ahmedabads of the north and the west.
I wanted you to unpack some of the things that you just said. I think for one, it would be helpful to, because the Sachar Committee report focused so much on the socioeconomic status of Muslims. Now, since 2006, one, of course, big change that has happened is the regime change, the coming of Narendra Modi-led BJP, which happens in 2014. But there are many other sort of changes that India has seen as well in terms of economic growth, in terms of GDP, in terms of really the sort of rights-based welfare state that was coming into being under the UPA, coming to fruition and so on. And I wonder what the statistics look like. When you say that it is much the same, are you saying that Muslims have not been able to partake at all of perhaps the economic growth that India has seen, or because, COVID again led to a certain kind of setback that is also a confounding factor?
Yeah. Well, this is where it is very important to look at a time series and see whether things have changed significantly or not. And we can do that. Data have become a problem in India, a huge problem. And the fact that there is no census is really making things complicated sometimes. But you can still use the statistics made available by the government, and see, for instance, that in terms of wealth, Muslims are lagging behind Hindus to a large extent. If you look at, for instance, the monthly wages by community, you will find that Hindu upper caste get something like 24,000 rupees a month as an average. Muslims are at half of that, 15,000. In fact, Muslims' wages and wealth are now very similar to Dalits, very, very similar. And in many states, Muslims are lagging behind. I mentioned caste on purpose. What is terribly interesting is to see that caste makes hardly any difference on the Muslim side. You know, there is this legend that Pasmanda Muslims are oppressed by upper caste Muslims in socio-economic terms. I don't mean that there is no difference in terms of status, but if you look at the figures, the Muslims per capita wealth of Pasmanda Muslims and the per capita wealth of Ashrafs, of upper caste Muslims, is almost the same. 4,000 for the upper caste Muslims, 31,000 for the OBC Muslims, Pasmanda Muslims. Upper caste Hindus are 865,000, which is twice what Hindu OBCs get. The gap between the upper caste Hindus and the OBC Hindus is very large, when on the contrary, you don't see much of a difference among Muslims, and Muslims are lagging behind OBC Hindus by far in terms of wealth. So there is no indication when you look at statistics, one, that Muslims are not lagging behind almost everyone else except SCSTs, and two, that there is a very large difference between the upper caste and lower caste Muslims. In that vein, what is more new and more disturbing in the fact that Muslims are leaving the education system. You know, we spent a lot of time trying to find out what happens in the education system. And again, the North-South divide is very neat, hardly any problem in the South, where, by the way, you have reservation for Muslims in many states. And on the contrary, you see Muslims lagging behind Hindus in the education system. What we've discovered is that you have a certain number of Muslims not attending the university anymore. And the percentage of upper caste Muslims, for instance, going to the university in Uttar Pradesh has declined from 14 to 12% in 10 years. And the dropout rate anyway in the school system is very high. It's very fascinating to see that in the beginning, in primary schools, you do have as many Muslim girls and boys as others. And then in the course of time, there are those who drop out the most. And that means that you need to know what happens, first of all, in the classroom. What is it to be a Muslim boy, a Muslim girl in the classroom today? How are you described, seen, treated? And secondly, the question is, what can Muslims do with a degree? What is the point? We do know that they are underrepresented in government jobs. That's another finding, very interesting finding. They are the most underrepresented in government jobs. They have no problem almost in the private sector, but to get a job in the government system is very difficult. And thirdly, another possibility is, well, they are not sufficiently affluent for affording to study. And you need to work more when you belong to a family of mechanics, when you are part of the informal sector as a boy, which is another question we explore. But this is definitely a key problem, because how do you have leaders, how do you have role models in a community that becomes less and less educated? If this is the future, it's a very problematic future.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing this up, Christophe, because I think a lot of people forget how diverse the Muslim population in India is, that it's not a homogeneous population, and caste is a big factor amongst Muslims as well because of the way India's reservation system is structured constitutionally. We think of caste when, as a sort of majority population issue, an issue with the Hindu population, but not so much with the Muslim population. Similarly, there are other diversities amongst the Muslim populations. There are different kinds of Islam practiced across India, of course. But I think one of the key things that you brought up initially was that secularism was more resistant. When you were talking about the attitude towards Muslims, you were talking about how in the south of the country, secularism has proven to be a little bit more resilient than in the north. I wonder if the other parameters also show similar north-south divides. For example, are the dropouts similarly problematic, the proportion of dropouts similarly problematic in the south, or is the Muslim population in the south socioeconomically mirroring the majority population more closely than it is in the north?
It is. In fact, any indicator, you can go by education, by socioeconomic status, by occupation, will show that the situation is better in the south. Of course, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, definitely, but also Andhra and Telangana. Another indication that is very interesting, Urdu. Urdu has become a language of the south. You look at the gap between the percentage of Muslims in Uttar Pradesh and the percentage of people speaking Urdu in Uttar Pradesh. This gap is widening. Less and less Muslims are in a position to speak their language, the language of their parents. You turn to Hyderabad, you turn to Bangalore, you turn to the south, of course not for the Tamil-speaking or Malayalam-speaking Muslims, but for the others, it has remained their language. And we see that also with the Urdu press. The Urdu press is a very interesting entry point also. You see there is a decline of the number of titles. And many in Urdu newspapers have to use Devanagari now for being read by Muslims in the north. So these are also statistics we produce.
But I was also keen on talking to you about Kashmir, but since time is short and Kashmir, in order to do it justice, will require a lot more depth of discussion. We will keep that for another time. I did want to ask you, Christophe, is that the picture's obviously grim, and it's even more disturbing than than it seems, because, like you pointed out, things were already bad in 2006 when the Sachar Committee report had come. And if things are even worse today, then that is indeed of grave concern. But I wonder where, even in this morass, some ray of hope could come from. And by that I mean, if there's something that you have found in your study, in your data, that shows that there are certain kind of parameters or certain kind of policy or social movements that have led to greater resilience or a better framework for Muslims to to tap into their rights from.
Well, social movements, I'm afraid the anti-CA movement showed that at the end there is repression and you send students to jail forever, which is certainly not a ray of hope at all. Now, the ray of hope for me came from the chemistry of the research group we created, Till you will have young Hindu PhD students, young Sikh PhD students, or not students at all, but people who are prepared to mobilize time and energy for exposing the kind of bias a minority is subjected to, there is hope. And this is where we find the energy for doing what we do. We know that there are still many people who do not agree with what's going on there. And one day, when the political scenario will permit, these resources, human resources, intellectual resources, will probably be easy to rejuvenate, reactivate for changing the scenario. And the scenario is certainly changing already when you see that socio-economic issues are staging a comeback. You can't ignore the joblessness question, and the moment you become more sensitive to socio-economic questions, you realize that you can't let 200 million people lagging behind, because in a very pragmatic manner, this is just anti-development. How do you develop a country without bringing on board such a large fraction of society? And it's true for, of course, Dalits the same way, Adivasi the same way. If you become development-oriented, well, you forget this kind of criterion that is religion, ethnicity. You try to develop everybody, and you try to give education to everybody in the first place. So yeah, I'm still hopeful that this will happen.
Thank you, Christophe. There's a lot more that I want to know. There's a lot more I'm sure Mukulika wants to know, and I'm sure that there'll be a lot more questions that our audience will have. Where can one see the results and the findings of this study? Where can one find out more about what you and your very talented group of researchers have been working on?
Well, there is a great website that is now released, and I'll send you the link so that you can surf on it.
Right.
And it will be updated as much as we can. We will keep it live, resisting attacks because they are bound to be attacks. And of course, there'll be a special issue of a journal, Contemporary South Asia, by the end of the year, and a book with Hearst and Co. sometimes in 2026.
We're going to link all of this in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christophe. That's it from us today. Pragya in New Delhi and Mukulika in London. Thank you and good.